this is a really important conversation, and some of you may be thinking, oh, I don't really need to pay attention here because this might be about pharma or healthcare professionals, and that doesn't correlate to the work that I'm doing. Well, we're here to tell you that if you connect in any way to a health or wellness brand, you should be paying attention because the laws are changing and they're getting a lot more complex. So I want to start with what is happening right now across the country with state data privacy laws. We are incredibly challenged within our federal government to pass federal legislation around data privacy. And so we are left with a hodgepodge of laws across the country, as you can see by this map. And the color variation is reflecting how every state seems to go about it in a different way. So some states are not, if you look back behind me, some states are not including health data as part of the provisions within their data privacy legislation. And then others are starting to look at it. So the state that has really driven a lot of change is Washington, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But you've also got Connecticut, Nevada, and New York following suit, but there's different nuances to each. So Washington, for example, has a private right of action. That is not good. You do not want to get sued. The others do not. So just need to start paying attention to this. And one of the things that we have done is put together some guidance that is for members only, along with our sister entity, the Coalition for Healthcare Communications. So you can go and learn more about navigating the health data privacy landscape, what are the laws, what is happening with HIPAA, and how it may impact you and your clients. So now I want to get into a conversation with Joshua and Christopher, also known as Josh and Chris. We were just having that conversation, so they'll go by either. But I want to talk about the situation that we're dealing with right now because it is ever evolving and changing. And I could start to get into some of the differences, but I think it'll be helpful for you two to share that. But we need to really start paying attention to some of the challenges. So talk about some of the shifts that you're seeing with your clients and how each of your agencies are really operationalizing these, because it's not as simple as it once was. So I'm going to start with Chris.
Sure. Well, first, I'm a strategist, which is really funny to be talking about operations. But the most important thing that we've been doing is resetting our global data governance rules. And that has a lot to do with how you get exposed. So the most important thing that we look at is, are you being exposed to any data that would conceivably be personal health information or PII? And that has a lot to do with opening up the black boxes of the vendors that you get. So a lot of people are talking about targeting, how they're collecting information, and what they're using that information to provide. You have to know your exposure to that. So that's sort of our standard approach. Where we are with clients is that our clients are pushing more and more towards personalization and the ability to collect segmentation information and retarget and rebuild your audience. That's where you start to get into tricky places, because people are giving you information that's been collected, and a lot of that information has been processed on their end, making sure that you're clean on your end and limiting your exposure.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that as well. And I would say, being an agency that primarily deals with health, and in particular pharma and kind of RX pharma, we are very much set up with a lot of those processes in place. But I will say, in any of the conversations you're having about this kind of like state-by-state legislation, a couple words keep coming up in those conversations, one of which is patchwork, right? I think you said hodgepodge, which leads to another word, which is it becomes a little problematic in terms of how you then interpret some of these, state-by-state legislation and apply it. I think Ashwini introduced it and said the word pickle, which is also, kind of an appropriate P word as well. But so I think it's taking a lot of these processes that we do have in place from an operational standpoint, from a legal guidance standpoint, I oversee a media planning team, so what does that mean for planning and strategy? And just kind of amping up those conversations and those touch points. And in particular, also thinking about where some of those roles traditionally were and thinking about where we need to kind of expand our role a little bit in terms of that. Because of this ever-evolving legislation, it's not okay anymore for the media planning team to say, hey, that's a legal thing, I don't really want to touch that, or I'm afraid to touch it, I'll leave it to legal experts. I am not a lawyer, and that is not my, not my training. My training is in media, but more and more I think we're feeling like we have to kind of understand that more, and so that way we can actually pull it through operationally.
One of the challenges, and I mentioned earlier that you're going to need to start paying attention to this if you are overseeing any sort of health and wellness messaging. So that means if you have a client with a dandruff shampoo, or you have a client who has some sort of fitness product, or any connection, I was saying, even if you have a toothpaste brand and you want to talk about gingivitis, that's oral health care. So you're going to really have to consider what is the messaging that you're putting out, and does it any way connect to this? Because this is not just about healthcare providers or insurers or doctors anymore. Another one of the challenges is that if you have a business, so one of the issues with the law is it also includes geolocation, which New York is using that. So the example I think that is most interesting is if you had a dermatologist that was inside a mall, you're not allowed to geofence. So now that is going to impact everyone who has a business in that location not to be able to leverage that. So think about today how you're using geolocation information, and now you've got geofencing going on. So how, Chris, should agencies be thinking about going about dealing with these changes, and what are some best practices that Abelson-Taylor is using, and for not only for data collection and processing, but how do you ensure that consumer privacy is maintained? Because that is the core essence of these laws, is ensuring that consumers' data is protected, and we all know that consumers are very protective of their health and financial information. They don't seem to understand that marketing information creates a better experience for them at times.
Yeah, that's the trick. They want a deeper experience, they want a deeper connection, but they also don't want to expose their data. Our best practices, I mentioned earlier, is we continually review our data governance policies, and anytime that there's a new legislation that's going into play, we were just talking about the new DTC regulations from the FDA, all of those things have an impact on how we're using information for targeting. The other thing is that we are very careful not to collect any personal information at all. And in DTC healthcare, that's essentially, you cannot collect that data unless it's opted in by the consumer who wants to have that information given to one of your clients. But in that case, we don't actually touch it. It goes directly into our clients' databases as a CRM. So our best practice is that we're, as I said earlier, constantly opening up the black boxes of our vendors. We have to know what they're saying when they're anonymizing data and they're providing us with that information. How are they doing that? How are they protecting a geofencing is a big issue, because they'll want to go by zip code, and then they'll want to go closer, and they'll want to go closer. But in Washington, I think it's 2,000 feet. You can't geofence within 2,000 feet of a healthcare provider. So those are the kinds of things we look at. And just be diligent. Know your exposure as best as possible.
That's really helpful. Joshua, what are some of your clients' concerns around the evolution of the state data privacy laws, and how are your clients dealing with the complexities and nuances regarding privacy? And if you could share an example on a client, that would be really helpful for the audience.
Yeah, I'm piggybacking off what you just said and kind of understanding your exposure. I think what's interesting is, all throughout kind of the media process, right, from media partners to the agency to the clients, it partly becomes a conversation around accountability, right, and kind of understanding this and operationalizing it and making decisions. And sometimes throughout that whole process, not everyone fully agrees with the interpretation, and that I think even within a client setting, there could be a brand marketing team who's coming at it from one angle versus a legal and compliance team that's coming at it from a certain angle. Same thing could happen within your agency, could happen with a media partner. So I think, to kind of answer that question, I think there's, robust conversations around how we're interpreting, a lot of this and how that sort of fulfills a marketing goal, how that, to what you said earlier, don't get sued, you know what I mean? So, it's just kind of figuring all that out. I think one example, just kind of going back in time, and the reason I use this example is because it was from 2018, but you can kind of, with so much of the consumer privacy legislation, it's happening kind of in real time right now, so we're not sure what the result of some of those, decisions are going to be. But looking back, we were talking about HCP. If you look at, the state of Colorado, right, in 2018 had a drug price transparency legislation come out, and it was that, in reaching HCPs in Colorado, you had to, in one-to-one communications, you had to disclose the wholesale acquisition cost. Everything I just said there's questions and up for interpretation, right? Like what counts, is it an HCP that's registered in Colorado? Is it an HCP that's in Colorado in that moment? When it's one-to-one, does that only mean email? Does it mean banners? How are you, listing the wholesale acquisition cost? And so there were, and there continue to be, many robust conversations around that with clients and kind of how they're interpreting it, how we're interpreting it, what we feel comfortable with, and kind of pulling that through. And so I think that theme is gonna only proliferate even more when it comes to consumer privacy as you have more and more states kind of, enacting this legislation.
Well, you raised another important point, which is how you interpret the laws and how you apply it, but also the need to get legal counsel to identify what some of the risks may be and how you need to be assessing how you go about executing your plans, your delivery, and making sure that you are complying with the laws in the various states. And we do have guidance also on state data privacy laws that we continually update because, as you saw from the map, it's just constantly evolving, and even states that have already enacted data privacy laws continue to update them. But I think that's a really helpful watch out. I want to go back to how your clients have reacted to that My Health, My Data Act from Washington, because that was the first state that really decided to include healthcare in a very overt way, in addition to adding a private right of action, because we haven't seen the states that have enacted data privacy laws go with a private right of action. So let me go back to Chris. Tell me, what is the situation you're in Washington, and how are you specifically dealing with it, and how have your clients reacted to that? Because it's different now, not just talking about healthcare professionals or D2C, you're also talking about OTC and a consumer lens versus what would be viewed as a patient lens.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the biggest play. Jason and I were both focused on healthcare, and we're focused in pharma. And so when we do DTC, there's a lot of regulations that were already in place. When you have something like, My Data, My Health, all of a sudden that changes everything when it comes to marketing HIPAA adjacent or pharma adjacent products, which even goes into everything that we were talking earlier about. It could be running shoes, it could be anything. If you're targeting somebody based on what could be interpreted as their health, whether it's they're looking at allergy medication, right? All of those things suddenly become personal health information. So you have to be able to make sure you're filtering out that personal health information in that area. So the question is about our clients. Well, our clients, one of the advantages and disadvantages of working in pharma is that our clients have a army of lawyers that review absolutely everything we do because of the FDA. So one of the things that they're coming to us and saying, how are you guys taking into this these new laws into play? Well, the fact is that they don't really have that much of an effect on us because we're not working in that space. But for everybody else, it's a huge place where suddenly you're going to be learning from pharma, marketing,
Hey, Chris,
from other areas.
Apparently people can't hear you as well. If you can just move the mic
I'm sorry.
closer.
Yeah. Is that
Thank
better?
you. Yeah, we're trying to manage.
So I think one of the things is you guys are going to be learning more on the general side on CPG products and OTC products from the practices of DTC pharma, because we're kind of adjacent to a lot of that stuff. We're already HIPAA compliant in everything we do, and the collection of personal health information is a no-no anyway. So when you guys start trying to target against information that you're learning about these products, you're going to have to step back and make sure you're cleaning that data.
How about you, Joshua?
I would say even with kind of pharma clients who are, used to having these conversations, when I think back to some of those conversations, the example I was giving around Colorado and HCPs, it's kind of like from a brand marketing perspective, it was sort of like you have to really encourage them to get in the conversation around it. But I think with things like Washington, where there are just, it reaches so much further, and some of the provisions are so much more kind of intense. It's just intensified those conversations, and I think really woken up all the areas of the client, particularly around brand marketing, to be like, no, we really do have to engage in this conversation and think this through.
Have you seen more of the legal teams getting involved given the impacts? Okay, that's helpful. Have you had to involve your legal counsel as well? Okay, so that's also another important factor as you just even think of agency costs and how that gets deployed back to clients and the time and energy that's spent. It also, I am guessing, puts a delay in the whole process and trying to go to market, which is another factor.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that we're hoping is that we see a federal level of intervention. Yeah, which sounds terrible. Nobody wants to think about it, but actually that would help level the playing field. The other thing is that I think having a third-party certification for our partners would be a tremendous help. So media companies who are starting up and pulling data and building new algorithms and helping sell that stuff, that there's a third-party validation for how they're complying with privacy acts.
How do you both see these laws evolving, and what are some of your concerns?
Yeah, I think, to your point, will there be national legislation that kind of gets at least some of the, core things that are being, addressed in some of the state-by-state legislation? So that's a question mark. I guess the other way to think about it is as more states start to adopt their own versions of those things, at what point will you end up almost with like a de facto sort of decision in terms of, it's one thing when there's 6 states doing it, it's another, what's that tipping point where you have enough states doing it where you're just gonna decide in kind of the execution of it, like, hey, we're not gonna do geofencing at all, or where you're gonna kind of find that common denominator. So I guess that's as much about how we react to it as what's gonna happen, but I think that part's still kind of unknown.
Right, and if that's the default, how is that gonna impact your marketing and
exactly.
your results?
Yeah, you always have to be the lowest common denominator. So you look at what is the most, in each of them they have different restrictions. So you look at what is the most aggressive restriction in each of those laws, and then you apply that universally across the board.
Do you have any concerns about what's happening right now or what could be happening based on what's being proposed in some of these newer states?
Absolutely. I mentioned earlier, our clients want deeper engagement with their customers and with their potential customers. And it's funny, we call it, decisions. It's about helping people make better healthcare decisions. And if you can't help them because you're not allowed to, it ruins the experience for them. A lot of these people are looking for information and are trying to engage in a way that you can't engage with them. So that becomes that contrast between deep engagement and compliance and some of these other things. So that's a challenge.
That's a great point on how do you have a positive customer experience and you're negatively impacting that. Okay, that's helpful. So we just have about a minute before we get to Q&A, so if you have questions, please put them in the EventMobi app. I did want to let you all know that because the complexities just continue when we look at health and data privacy, and again, this is now impacting a broader health landscape with health and wellness, we do have a webinar with our Head of Government Relations and Sustainability, Allison Pepper, and our VP of Government Relations, Amanda Anderson, as well as Mike Signorelli from Venable, which is our outside general counsel that works with us closely. So March 26th, 12 to 1 Eastern. For those of you who are interested, you can go to our website and sign up. I just want to say, just really quickly, that there will continue to be more challenges for marketers and agencies, and we will do our best to keep you updated on what those changes are, but it is definitely going to continue to evolve, and it will take time before our federal government steps in, just based on the pattern that we've seen. And they seem to be more distracted by other elements right now, including AI. So there's a lot that has to be done, but the need to understand consent for advertising and marketing, as I said, for sale and managing for a period of time, you're gonna have to pay attention to that and what you do. You're gonna have to make sure that you're reviewing your contracts regularly and understanding the language and really looking at the nuances there, again, legal counsel, and how you're working with various vendors to make sure that you're indemnified and protected so that if there is some sort of data breach, you are covered for that. So thank you to Josh and Chris. Now I want to go to Amy and see what questions you have.
Thanks, Marlo. One audience question we have is, how do you think AI will impact the data privacy conversation? Will it solve more problems than it creates?
Do you want to answer that? I can take a stab at that one. Yeah, that's something that's really interesting. So obviously all of the targeting and audience profiling is built on machine learning, and now you start to apply generative AI. So generative AI is going to, for us, it's a real concern about where does it sit in the sandbox, because if you're starting to use it to help augment your strategy work, is it interacting with information that it shouldn't be interacting with? And that's where we have to be very careful. You have to make sure that when you're using information to train your AIs, that information itself has been cleaned and anonymized.
Yeah, I would agree with that too, and I would just say that the AI is evolving and kind of our sort of what we can sort of, it's imperfect, so what we can sort of trust in that, and sort of how we're attacking some of these things when it comes to adherence to ever evolving laws. So you just kind of have to decide, like, where does that play a role and where are we not quite there yet,
In what ways is the healthcare industry shifting targeting strategies in the with the upcoming demise of cookies?
Sure, yeah. So, I would say when it comes to the state-by-state privacy legislation, one of the kind of, POVs and recommendations in there is to lean more into contextual, because you aren't using that one-to-one data, and you're not necessarily collecting that one-to-one data, certainly not for consumers. And so similarly around cookies, that is also guidance that's given. So I think what's interesting in the conversation is that when it comes to privacy in general, there's a lot of issues and changes that a little bit conflated, but also some of the solutions can be solutions for all those different things as well. So,
yeah, I think we're all looking at what is the cookieless future, and I think one of the things that we look at is how are you using aggregated data in a different way. Obviously, zero-party data gives you a great set of models to build off of, which is perfectly compliant so far with every one of the laws that's out there. So I think that, when we look at it, again, it's trying to find a way to build the models that keep the information anonymous, and then use those models to try to create a deeper experience.
Are you able to use contextual targeting, or is that expected to go away as well?
So far you can. Yeah, right. Yeah, we haven't seen any state, legislation against that. So yeah.
Yeah. The My Health, My Data specifically calls out contextual. So if you're in adjacent information and your product and information is relevant to that content, then it's perfectly fine. Well, it's not perfect, but it's close.
But that's also interesting because you don't usually see contextual called out. That's basically the initial form of advertising. So it's a bit concerning that it's being called out in a data privacy law.
There are some concerns about conversations with client partners that could be considered legal advice in healthcare. How do you navigate that risk?
That's a great question. So, on the agency side, we can certainly provide our POV, we can certainly provide an understanding of the landscape, but to I think the point of that question, we're not providing legal advice to our clients. I mean, they have their own legal and privacy teams who can take the information, the POVs we give them, and make their own decisions about, how they want to, again, interpret these laws and, from a legal perspective. But yeah, we're not providing that legal advice in that way.
Yeah, I completely agree. We're not there to give them legal advice. We're there to be compliant. So it's our responsibility to remain compliant and then work with their legal teams to be able to fit within what they feel is appropriate interpretations. Of course, a lot of what we're dealing with is FDA regulations, and the FDA regulations are actually changing. So we're looking at new regulations over the next. Well, the May 20th, I think, is the implementation of the DTC regulations, but then there's expected to be more coming as well.
And last question, are there any other subjects currently going through the national conversation that you're focused on, like Section 230, for example?
Do you want to answer that? I don't really have an answer for that. I think part of what what we're hoping for is to see some sort of balance across all regulations for guidance. And I think, the white paper that these guys put together, I highly recommend everybody read it. The advice to agencies is really important, particularly if you're collecting information that you're using for retargeting and you need to have you have to have a opt-out ability for people to pull their data down and remove it. And I don't think that answered your question. But.
I think that's perfect. I think we're going to end here. Thank you so much, Joshua and Christopher, and thanks all of you.